So, in this series of lectures, we're going to go ahead and start talking about international trade, finance, international finance, and exchange rates. So, let's go ahead and start with international trade. And I think everybody already knows we have exports. We had our original GDP accounting equation, y equals C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. So GDP equals consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So imports, we write M, and X minus M is our net exports. If our net exports are positive, then we have a trade surplus. If our net exports are negative, then we have a trade deficit. Now, those may be things that people have heard already. What we're going to go ahead and see is that there's going to be a connection between the international trade in goods and international finance. Because remember, we can also take this GDP accounting equation and we can go ahead and move some terms over here. So we're going to move the C and the G over to the left-hand side, and that leaves us with investment spending and net exports on the other side. And remember that this side over here is national savings. And there's two things we can do with national savings. Either we can invest them and use them to build the capital stock in our economy, engage in real investment spending, or we can go ahead and we can take that output and send it overseas. We can sell more than we buy. So we can either think of this as net exports, or when we sell people more than we buy from them, we effectively would be lending them the money to buy the products in excess of the amount that we bought from them. So we can also call this what's called net capital outflow. So if we lend more to others, net capital outflow, NCO, is greater than zero if we lend more than we borrow. Net capital outflow is negative if we borrow more than we lend. So it gets a little bit confusing to talk about net capital outflow. We can talk about net capital outflow being negative, or we can talk about a country experiencing net capital inflow. So that's another way of thinking about it. So let me move to a new sheet. So it's equivalent to say that net capital outflow is negative, or we could say that net capital inflow is positive, or another way we could phrase that is a country is borrowing more from overseas than it is lending. So those are all synonymous statements here. And if we wanted to just make sure that we got this here, the reason why it's net capital outflow equals capital outflows minus capital inflows. That's why it's net capital outflow. A capital outflow is when the U.S. invests overseas. A capital inflow is when people overseas or in foreign countries invest in the U.S. Okay. So another way of looking at all this is that if you go back here, realize that what we've essentially said here is that net exports equal net capital outflow. So all of these statements here are also equivalent to saying if net capital outflow is negative, then that's the same thing as saying net exports is negative, which is equivalent to saying we have a trade deficit. So there's an essential connection between the trade in goods and international financial flows.